Good. Welcome to my talk, Evidence for How to Make Great Games, Actions to Take from the Game Outcomes Project. What is this? This is actually part of a series of talks that Avalanche Studios in New York gave in the month of July. What happened is there's an organization in New York called Playcrafting, and they organize game industry events throughout New York. And during July, they partnered with Avalanche Studios to organize a series of talks. I gave one of those talks, but that talk wasn't recorded. So what I decided to do is I decided to, in my own living room, record that talk again and then upload that talk. So that's what you're seeing here. Okay, so what are we doing today? We're going to talk about the Game Outcomes Project, and then we're going to talk about all the things that they found either do matter or don't matter, that make a difference or that help or just don't make a difference. And we'll start off with the things that make the least difference, and we'll end with the things that make the most difference for what makes successful games or what doesn't make successful games. And we'll also have some practical advice at the end there. So what is the Game Outcomes Project? The Game Outcomes Project was a study that tried to find out what do successful game teams do and what do unsuccessful game teams do. They presented this as a series of articles on Gamasutra. The articles looked like this, and they were written by this person, Paul Tozur. And he was kind of the main organizer of this project, so that's why I put his face here, but there were also other people involved. And the reason why I'm giving this talk is because I think that the things that they found are so important that everyone should know about this. I think like every game developer should know this. I think they should teach this in game development school. I think it should just be common knowledge. But I found personally that people tend to not know about this project, and I think it's really important. So what did they do? They performed an anonymous survey where they asked game developers about previous projects that they had worked on. And so they asked them about completed projects, things that they'd already finished before taking the survey. And they asked them to think back and answer many questions on a 7-point scale between like agree completely to disagree completely. So example questions would be down here. We have, for example, it was difficult to get or give honest feedbacks without feelings getting hurt. You can say I agree somewhat, or I disagree completely, or I disagree slightly. Like you have a scale to answer on. And then what they try to do is they try to correlate all these answers with how successful or unsuccessful a game was. When they started this study, they didn't quite know how to measure the success of a game. So what they did is they asked 4 different questions, which they would then use to kind of figure out the success of a game. The 4 questions were: was the project delayed or did it ship on time? How much money did the game make or did it lose money? What was the Metacritic of the game? And were the internal goals of the project met? So was the team happy with the game that they made? This last question is kind of for like they thought of maybe like some indie developers. They want to make like an art game and it doesn't even need to be financially successful. They just want to get it out there and they just want people to play it, and then they're happy. It was kind of something like that they had in mind. So then after they were done with this study, they tried to get some kind of success score out of these 4 questions. They went through their data, and what they ended up with is they just used the average of these 4 scores and said that's how successful this game was. If you want to know more about why they did that, you have to go look at their articles, but I'm just using the same thing. I'm just using the aggregate score. Okay, I'm going to show a lot of data, so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to display the data. This is what they chose to do in their articles. They have these tables where they have on the left, they have the question that says, for example, it was safe to take a risk on this team and stick your neck out to say something that needed to be said. And they correlate that question with each of their success factors with like delays, how much money, Metacritic, and internal goals. And they also correlated with the aggregate score of all 4 average. And so I thought this doesn't work very well for a presentation. And actually also it doesn't work very well for me because I don't know what these correlation numbers are. I don't know what it means for there to be a correlation of 0.3. But the other thing that they did is, which I like more, is they did a scatter plot. So this is a scatter plot for the question, I worked a lot of overtime or crunched on this project. And then they had correlated this with the ROI, how much money did the game make. And then also drew a trend line, so you can see the more you agree with this question, the more overtime you work, the more money you tend to lose, the less money you tend to make. Which kind of makes sense because if you think about it, you have to think that if your game is about to lose money, you will probably start working overtime to make up for it, so that you don't lose money, right? So the causation here probably goes the other way around. So I like this scatter plot much more. There's two things here that I don't like. One is I don't like the trend line, because I think trend lines always take your conclusions away from you. I feel like you should look at the data yourself and make up your own mind. The other thing that I didn't like about this is they have a lot of overlapping points here. So they have a lot of points, for example, in the bottom right corner, but you cannot see that because it's just overlapping, so you just see a single ring, and that doesn't quite work. So here's what I chose to do for the same question. I have the question at the top. I worked a lot of overtime or crunch on this project, and then I've got all the answers that people gave scattered in the middle. So the first change I made is I scattered all the points a little bit so that you can actually see each individual point. And the second thing I did is I gave each point a little halo around, so that when there's a lot of points in the same spot, the halos kind of add up on top of each other, and you can see clusters like that. So you can see kind of like there's not a very strong trend line here. Like as soon as I remove the trend line, you can see that the trend is actually not very strong at all. You can still be all the way up and down on these success scales. Oh yeah, sorry, I should talk about this success scale. So on the x-axis, I've got the answers for the question from disagree completely to agree completely. And on the y-axis, I have the aggregate score. So what that means is if you're higher up, if like one person's higher up, that means they shipped on time, they made lots of money, they had a good Metacritic, and they internally were happy with the game that they made. If you're further down, then it means your game was delayed, you lost money, you had a bad Metacritic, and the team was unhappy with the game that they made. Yeah, so in this question, like you can see the trend line, like without trend line, of course I was talking, it's not that strong. But we can still kind of see some clusters. Like if you're more on the right, you tend to cluster further down. If you're more on the left, you tend to cluster further up. So there's like some trend in the clusters up, even though like there's still lots of outliers that seem to like contradict the overall trend. So the way the talk is going to work is we're going to go from things that matter least to things that matter most. So at the beginning of the talk, we'll have lots of plots that kind of look like this. This is the question: the company's culture prefers face-to-face communication over email. And this plot, I cannot see any trend at all. This is completely, there's no correlation here. So no matter which one you answer, you can be all the way up and down on the success scale. So for this question, no matter which one, like this question will not impact whether you make a good game or not, right? You can either be all face-to-face or all email. You can make a great game, you can make a terrible game, either way, right? And as we go, so we will start with slides that look like this. And as we go through the talk, we start to see more and more trends. So at some point we'll see things like this. Some team members put their own careers above the collective goals of the game project. And then here we see like, okay, we see a slight downward trend. Like now we can actually see, okay, on the left they're higher than on the right. And then as we go through the talk, at some point we start seeing really clear trends. So this is the slide with the strongest trend there is. And I didn't show the question up here, because this is the question we get to at the very end. This is the very last question. This is very exciting. This is to find out what this slide will be. So because if you're like all we have in this study is just correlations, but this one there's a very clear correlation here. Like if you're all the way on the right, if you say agree completely, then all the people who did that, they are average or above. And all the people who say they disagree completely, they're average or below. So like even though all we have is correlations here, you definitely want to be in the group on the right. So you definitely want to be like, I agree completely with whatever this question is, and we get to this question at the end because this is exciting. Okay. We start off with financial incentives, but I actually have to make a cut here in the camera because the camera I'm using can only record 10-minute intervals. So I pause here and restart in just a second. Okay. Yeah, so I start off with financial incentives because they work a little bit different than all the other questions, so I kind of couldn't put them in, so I just put them at the beginning. So here's a question where they asked whether you got royalties or revenue sharing tied to the product's financial performance or total sales. People who said no are on the left, people who said yes are on the right. And yeah, in this question, basically there's no clear trend visible. Dots, I mean, there's more dots on the left than there's dots on the right. but otherwise we can't really tell any difference between them. Like there's not like all the dots on the right are higher up. So this one doesn't seem to matter any, like it doesn't seem to make any difference for the quality of the game. Next they asked, did you get bonuses tied to team performance as evaluated internally? Same thing, doesn't seem to make any difference. Bonuses tied to the game's critical review or Metacritic rating. We don't have that much data here, just a few dots. The few dots that we have don't seem to indicate any trend. At least they don't seem to indicate a positive trend, so it doesn't seem to help. And finally, we have bonuses tied to individual performance. So this, the question was actually a little bit longer, but these are like very specifically tailored bonuses, which it's like, oh, like if you finish this feature next week, then we give you like a $1,000 bonus, like something very specific like that. These are the only dots where these are the only bonuses where the dots on the right seem to be slightly higher than the dots on the left. So in the survey, they concluded that in general, financial incentives seem to not make any difference. Like they don't seem to help, they don't seem to hurt, they don't make a game better or worse, except for maybe these help ever so slightly. So if you have to do financial incentives, like if you think that they're like really important for you, if you really believe in them, maybe this one slightly, but overall it doesn't seem to make any difference. Next, we have the first real part, which is things that don't make any difference. And this part's actually kind of cool because there's a lot of things in here that we argue about a lot, and they found that they don't make any difference, so we can stop arguing about them. Isn't that great? So here's one. Our team relied significantly on temporary workers, contractors, or other team members who were not full-time members of the studio. Yeah, and this doesn't make any difference, right? If you can agree completely and you can make a great game or a terrible game, you can disagree completely, you can make a great game or a terrible game. And I mean, the clusters don't tell us anything, it just doesn't make any difference. All team members were exclusively dedicated to this project throughout the development process rather than working on several projects at once. So sometimes they asked similar questions, or they asked like the same question in multiple ways just to like confirm it, or also just to find differences. And sometimes those questions they cluster together like this, where like it's a similar question, but like both of them don't make any difference. And sometimes actually what happens is if you ask the same question in slightly different ways, they do make a difference. And I will point out some of those throughout the talk because I think those are interesting. We can learn things from them. But here's just like, yeah, it doesn't make any difference. The company's culture preferred face-to-face communication over email. We already had this. It doesn't make any difference. What software development methodology did the development team use for the majority of development? We've got don't know, waterfall, agile using Scrum, or other ad hoc. And it doesn't seem to make any difference which one you pick. Like, you can be all the way up and down on the success scale no matter which one of these you choose. Average team size. So, do bigger teams make better games, or do smaller teams make better games? The answer is it doesn't seem to matter at all. You can make a great game no matter the size of your team, or you can make a terrible game no matter the size of your team. Our developers were organized into cross-functional teams, or teams that combine developers from several disciplines, artists, engineers, etc. So this is, did you have teams by feature, meaning like I've got some engineers, artists, designers working together to finish one feature, or is your team says here's all the engineers, here's all the artists, here's all the designers, and they're all separate. Whichever you pick doesn't seem to make any difference. So just pick one and you can make a great game or a terrible game, but it won't depend on this question. There was someone on this team I considered a close friend. So we don't have much data on the left, people seem to generally be friendly, but the data on the right suggests that there's no trend. We re-estimated how long tasks would take frequently or on a day-to-day basis. So this kind of like daily stand-up saying how long, like I'm going to take this much more longer. Yeah, it doesn't seem to make any difference at all. Deadlines in our studio were treated as matters of life and death with significant consequences if they were not met. Maybe super slight downward trend, but not really like super slight. So we experienced difficulty communicating with outsourced or external developers working with our team. So this is kind of asking about like outsourcing and saying, so we already said outsourcing doesn't make a difference, and now it says outsourcing, and the outsourcing didn't go too well, and it still doesn't make a difference. Maybe like super slight downward trend, but not really. So outsourcing just doesn't seem to matter, even if it goes badly, it won't impact your game all that much. The team's engineers practice some form of code reviews or pair programming regularly. This kind of upsets me because I kind of like these things, but they don't seem to actually make that big of a difference or at all. We met daily to discuss what we were working on and identify production bottlenecks. Right, so this is your daily stand-ups, your scrums, don't make any difference. I messed up my mouse clicker. Okay, we're back. The priorities for each new milestone or sprint were determined based on the current state of the project each time, rather than deriving from a predetermined overall development plan. So this is asking how much waterfall are you doing, and yeah, similar picture. There was some sort of design document available to the team near the beginning of development that clearly specified the game we were trying to make. Doesn't make a difference. I want to talk actually a little bit about correlation and causation, because all we see here is correlations, right? And so if all you have is a, well, if you have a correlation, that doesn't automatically mean that you have a causation, right? It's kind of like a hint that there might be causation here. Maybe we should look into this, but it doesn't automatically mean a causation. On the other hand, if you have no correlation at all, that does mean that there can be no causation, because a causation will cause a correlation to appear. So if you had a causation, we would see it here. So a complete lack of correlation definitely means a complete lack of causation. So actually, from that standpoint, I kind of like these early graphs more, because the lack of causation can prove definitely that there's no causation here. So these actually can take definite answers from. The later ones they're more hints than definite conclusions. Okay. Project leaders created detailed plans for our project when we started and followed them very closely throughout the project. Right, so this is, are you doing waterfall? And like, no one says they do waterfall completely, but there's still no trend line. Right? The tasks I worked on were a good fit for my skill set. I would have expected this one to matter. It doesn't seem to actually matter. There's people on the left who say they had a terrible match for their skill set, right? Maybe some like super good programmer who had to do all the audio for the game, and he was terrible at it, but the game still turned out great somehow. So that's interesting. The person who was responsible for doing a task determined how much time would be allocated to it. Right? So I would love it if I had it. I would love it if I had this, but it doesn't actually seem to make much of a difference. So what are the main points that we can learn from all this? So whatever you choose from these, it won't impact whether you make a good game or a bad game, right? So just pick one, and you can either make a great game or terrible game, but it won't depend on these things. It will depend on the things that come later in the talk. But all these early things, just pick one and then be happy or be sad, but that will depend on other things. So we've got production methodology, team size and location, might be like all in one place or like email or whatever. Cross-functional teams or not, and outsourcing or not, just doesn't seem to make any difference. Those were kind of like the main themes in this section that I took out of this. I put another camera cut here just so we can continue here in part 3 in a second. Okay, before we get to part 3, I actually kind of want to take a brief aside and talk about how interesting these various graphs are. And so because the graphs in this talk, they kind of follow a curve. So the section we just had is what doesn't matter. That was kind of interesting, I thought, because I was like, hey, all these things that we always talk about, they don't actually make that much of a difference, or at all. The next section will be things that maybe matter a little bit, like maybe they matter, maybe they don't. Those are actually super boring, because all of them are like, maybe we should do this or not. Nobody cares. The next section, what probably matters, that's a little bit more interesting, like I'll talk about some of those. Then we have what really matters, that's really interesting. And finally, there's the top 10, which is like top of the chain for interestingness. So that's what we want to get to. So what I actually do is this next section, what maybe matters a little bit, I basically skip over completely. I almost won't be talking about it. The section afterwards, I skip over like half the questions in there, and then we can quickly get to the interesting parts. So brace yourselves, because this next part will be fast. Things that maybe help hurt a little bit. What sort of technology solution did the team use to create the game? So here we see that new engine maybe is slightly lower, an engine from previous game or similar game, maybe slightly higher, but most other choices don't actually make any difference. So maybe you reuse your tech from a previous game if you can help, or just make a similar game again. We received some form of coaching or guidance to enhance our effort to improve our effectiveness as team members. When team members had difficulty performing in tasks, others were quick to offer them support. I worked a lot of overtime or crunched on this project. The team often engaged in unfiltered and passionate debate of ideas. Please select the answer below that best describes the overall level of experience of the game development team. Alright, so here we see that people with more than 8 years of experience seem to actually be doing better, but before that it doesn't make that much of a difference. Right? Like there's maybe a slight upward trend, but it seems to only matter if you have a good chunk of experience. Team members held one another accountable for their actions. Team members frequently discussed the issues and challenges they faced. I had all the software and hardware I needed to do my job effectively. The project experienced a major technology revamp in development, such as a new game engine or major engine changes. Alright, so we already kind of don't want to do a new engine, also don't want to do big tech changes. Like slight downward trend on this. The entire team was involved in prioritizing the work to be done for each milestone or sprint. If the team leadership didn't like an idea, it was quickly swept under the rug. There was someone at this organization who encouraged me to develop my skills further. So we already had coaching, now we're talking about like skills and encouragement. Both of them have like a slight upward trend. It wasn't always clear who was supposed to be doing what on the project. Team members were held accountable for meeting their deadlines. The team composition didn't change during the course of the project other than growing when needed. Most team members were able to determine their own work processes and workflows. The portion of the project that were outsourced to external developers were not worth the resources spent and yielded a generally unsatisfactory product. So we had at the beginning, we had like these questions about outsourcing, and this is like the one that's like, oh man, we did outsourcing and it was completely terrible. It was a complete waste of money. And still there's only a slight downward trend, right? So it seems like you can still make a great game even if you can still make a really good game even if your outsourcing is a complete waste of money. So it doesn't make much of a difference. Just like either do it or don't do it, but don't argue about it too much. So what are the main points? You want to reuse the tech from previous game and avoid big tech changes. You want to have like frequent, unfiltered, open discussion, stable team with clear responsibilities, skill development, coaching, and mutual accountability. Those are kind of like the main trends that I saw in this section. So here's things that probably help. These are like more helpful, better. It was difficult to get or give honest feedback without feelings getting hurt. Right, so you want to be able to like receive feedback and not be like all insulted as soon as someone like tells you something about your work. People tended to keep failed ideas to themselves and this organization. So I put fearless communication here because like this topic actually comes up several times, and like the fearless part of it is kind of the common theme of all these questions. Or safe communication also. You don't want to be like afraid to talk about things that went badly. The entire team met frequently to openly discuss topics of interest and ask questions. Yes. Actually, there was a similar question earlier that mattered less, and then in this question they added the section of asking questions. So frequent meetings maybe have a little bit, frequent meetings and asking questions seems to have slightly more. Also interesting. The tools we used generally worked well and allowed us to be productive, right? Upward trend. Not super strong, but there's an upward trend. You don't want to be all the way on the left on this, basically. The project leads frequently call out when team members performed well. So we've got like public positive feedback. Team members' tasks were well defined and clearly specified. The team experienced one or more reorganizations during development that changed its composition or its structure. I often worked overtime because I was required or felt pressured to. So we had a question about overtime earlier, which had a slight downward trend, but not a very strong one. This one has a stronger downward trend. Like, so if you feel required or pressured to work overtime, that seems to be more correlated with bad outcomes. So you probably want to avoid doing this, or you want to avoid getting into situations where you have to do this. The team gave me plenty of opportunities to learn, grow, and improve my skill set. So we already had other questions about like learning and growth. We had like a question about coaching and encouragement. This is kind of the third question in this set. And actually I want to take a quick aside because I thought it was interesting in the order in which these came. Because we had three questions. We had the team gave me plenty of opportunities to learn, grow, and improve my skill set. That has a higher correlation than there was someone at this organization who encouraged me to develop my skills further. That has a high correlation. Then we received some form of coaching or guidance to enhance our effort or improve our effectiveness as a team. I thought these were interesting because I wouldn't have put them in that order. I would have actually put them in the exact opposite order. I would have thought opportunities are good, encouragement is better, and coaching is best. Because coaching means you actually put money behind it, right? Turns out it's the other way around. Like, coaching is good, encouragement is better, opportunities are best. So that didn't quite make sense to me until I thought like this top question, like what does someone look like who like agrees completely or disagrees completely? So someone who disagrees completely, what I'm thinking of is like, imagine someone starts at a huge studio and like they get told, or like it's an animator and they get told, okay, you're going to clean up motion capture data, and that's all you're going to do for the next 2 years. Right? Just like we get mocap data and you clean it up and then it gets in the game. That one has no opportunities for growth at all. And then on the other hand, someone who agrees completely, like let's say in that same position, they clean up mocap data, but then they get opportunities. Maybe they get to like go out to the mocap sessions, like talk to the actors, like work with them, make sure everything works better. Or maybe they actually get to work with designers, get the animations into the game, see what designers actually want from them, they interact with different people. Like there's opportunities for growth there, right? I can totally see how that helps. At the same time, if you think about like coaching, like the coaching that the first person would receive is they would get training in getting better at cleaning up mocap data, but that doesn't really allow them to grow, right? They just still do this one thing. So I kind of thought the order was interesting, and yeah, that's how I wanted to point this out. Actually, somebody asked me when I gave the talk, like, doesn't coaching include, or doesn't opportunities include coaching? And I think it does not, because I actually don't ever receive any coaching, but where I work at Avalanche, I receive plenty of opportunities for growth. So I think you can have opportunities without coaching. So yeah, coaching is good, encouragement is better, opportunities are best. Good. My unique skills and talents were valued and utilized while working on this team. The organizational structure and membership of the team were clear from the outset of the project. Team members often praise each other for a job well done. So we already had public positive feedback. Now we also have like mutual feedback between people. That also seems to be important. Most team members were well trained in our studio's production methodology. So I said at the beginning that production methodology doesn't seem to make any difference. You can pick whichever you like, Agile, Scrum, or Waterfall, whatever you like. But what does seem to make a difference is whichever methodology you do choose, make sure all your people are well trained in it. Make sure they understand how the studio works, how tasks get assigned, like who's responsible, like all those things. So I wrote here, explain how the studio works, basically. So whichever methodology you pick, make sure your people understand how it works and yeah, and how to be effective in it. I understood clearly what was expected of me as a team member. Team members' responsibilities and job roles were carefully matched with their particular skills and abilities. This one I thought was interesting because very early in the talk we had a question which was that my skills and abilities were a good match for my tasks, and that had no correlation at all. But if you ask about the team, if you ask about other people, all of a sudden it has a strong correlation. I don't quite know what that means. It's an interesting little thing. There's an upward trend here. As a result of the separation of disciplines, smaller teams often fought for different priorities rather than collaborating. So now at this point in the talk, we're kind of starting to see like clearer trends, right? There's a downward trend here, some pretty clear. So this one for me, for example, means that well, we've got like team A wants to do X, team B wants to do Y, and those are competing goals, and then they just both go off and try to get their competing goals into the game, rather than working together on a shared thing. You want to avoid that. You want to get them back on the same track. Some important things went unsaid during development because the team feared conflict. Right? Fearless communication. You don't want, if people are afraid of talking, well, you get a downward trend. Some team members put the ego or their own need for recognition above the collective goals of the game project. Right, so this is kind of related to the one where the teams go off to different things. You also don't want people working for their own interest. You want them to work for the team's best interest, for everyone's best interest. Members had easy access to communicate with senior leadership about the project, raise concerns, or discuss personal issues. Right, your leads and seniors should be accessible. When significant changes to the core design or architecture of the game occurred, all stakeholders in the studio participated in the decision to make changes. Mistakes were treated as learning opportunities or a chance to improve, not a nail in your coffin. Right, so this is once again like fearless, but also feeling safe in the organization, not being afraid of like if something goes wrong, you're immediately in trouble. Internal politics played a big role in the dynamics of the team. Right, just avoid this. Everyone hates this stuff. I felt confident that if I expressed an opinion, people would listen and I could change their minds. Right, we already had being able to receive feedback. Right, you also want to be able to change your mind if you have to. Right, like you shouldn't just. Yeah, it's a good thing to be able to change your mind if there's good reasons to. So what are the main points from this section? Being able to receive feedback, fearless communication, stable teams with clear roles and responsibilities, collective goals instead of people going off going in different directions, and positive feedback. Those were kind of trends that we saw in this section. Good. And with that, we finally get to the main section, the one that really is important. What really helps and really hurts. Actually, I think I'll do another camera cut here and continue in a second. The organization encouraged taking creative risks regardless of outcome. Good thing. We discussed our failures openly in this organization. So we already had lots of like fearless and safe communication. Also, this falls in the same category. Personnel issues within the team, teamwork problems, HR issues were dealt with professionally and appropriately. Right? So just like it's a thing you should just do. Just like be professionals and work in a professional team. Team members often express frustration that their opinions were ignored. So in the previous section we had things about like being able to receive that feedback. It's also really bad if you ignore feedback. If people tell you something is up and you just ignore it, well, that's bad. I was hesitant to take creative risks in this organization. Team members or studio leaders accurately estimated how long tasks would take. So this one, I don't actually think this one's about estimating because, well, nobody estimates very well. Like almost no one says that they agree completely with this question. Instead, I think this question is about the people who disagree completely because those are all in trouble. And so, like think about a team that disagrees completely with this. They're not upset that like the estimates were wrong. They are upset that like their schedule just made no sense. Like they were promising to do like features A to Z, but they could only deliver like 5 of those features. And like there was no way they could do all the things that they had promised to do. So I think this question is much more about having a realistic schedule. That would be my lesson to learn from this. This seems to be an important thing. I felt comfortable sharing my creative attempts with my team leads. Creative risks seem to be the theme in this section. Decisions regarding technological changes were well communicated and understood by all team members. So earlier I said you want to avoid doing big tech changes. If you have to do big tech changes, it seems to really help if you communicate them well. you make sure your whole team understands it. If you change something in your process and you say, okay, we used to do it like this, now it works like this, just make sure people are on board and everyone knows and they understand. If you worked overtime, I believe it was because studio leaders or producers failed to scope the project properly, meaning insufficient manpower, deadlines that were too tight, overpromised features. So once again, I don't think this is a question about overtime. I think this is also a question about schedule. Like they said we worked overtime, and the reason was that our schedule made no sense. So realistic schedule seems to be a really important thing, because it is in this section of the things that really help or hurt. My peers on the team were committed to making a great game. Right, so this is a cool thing. If you work in a team like this, who doesn't like that? And the main thing you can do this is hiring good people, or hiring the right people, kind of. The team received some form of direct feedback on a regular basis as to how well we were doing. Right, so feedback is a thing that's really important. Actually, I think the next question, yes, this one's also feedback. It says, team members will often work for weeks at a time without receiving feedback from project leads or managers. Right, so these questions, it's about like, you want to give direct feedback to people, and you want to give feedback regularly. If the feedback comes in too late, that's like really hurting, right? It's easy to fix it when, well, if I needed to know 2 weeks ago and you tell me like 2 weeks later, well, that's going to be bad, right? Now it's so much more work to change it than it would have been 2 weeks ago. So if somebody needs to know something, tell them quickly, and don't delay too much on that, and tell them directly. The mission and/or values of this organization made sense to me, and I believed in them. This one I thought is interesting because I would have put this at the beginning of the talk. I would have, like, if you had asked me, I would have thought it's in the section of all the questions that don't make any difference. Turns out it isn't. Turns out it's in the section of things that really make a difference. So it seems like if your company has values or has a mission, that actually makes a difference. Like the kinds of companies who have values and missions, they are also the kinds of companies that make better games. Interesting thing to know. Novel ideas were celebrated at this organization, even if they didn't achieve their intended result. Team members held each other to high standards for the particular discipline, art, design, engineering, etc. Right? So if people have high standards, that's a good thing. I was sometimes surprised by receiving feedback much later than I needed it, or seeing things in a performance review that had never been mentioned before. So we already had regular direct feedback, just reinforcing this. Depending on how you ask it, it gets a stronger correlation. The organization had a clearly defined mission statement or set of values. There was a lot of turnover on this project, so this is clearly a bad thing. You'd want to avoid having to like replace people or losing good people. Most team members care deeply about the vision of this game. So that's also engaged team. That's a really good thing. It was safe to take a risk on this team and stick your neck out to say something that needed to be said. So at this point, I had to bring the fearless and safe communication. I had to bring it back because depending on how you ask it, it just seems like a really important thing. Feeling safe on the team, like safe to speak up, safe to take creative risks, and yeah, all those good things. Our team sometimes seem to be stuck in a cycle of never-ending crunched overtime work. So this is the last question about crunch, and it's clear now my trend here, which is, yeah, not only did you do crunch, but it was never-ending. I don't want to talk about crunch too much because in the articles I talked a lot about crunch, and I think I actually kind of took away from the more important lessons that were to be learned. But I want to say one thing, which is they try to figure out what is actually the causation here. Is it that bad games cause crunch, or is it that crunch causes bad games? Right? Is it that if you do lots of crunch, you make a bad game, or is it if you make a bad game, well, you do lots of crunch in order to try to fix it, even if it doesn't really help? And so what they tried to do is they tried to build a predictive model where they used all the other questions that they asked, like about creative risks and like realistic schedule and engaged team and all those things. They used all the other questions to predict where would you put a game on this scale, right? And let's say if depending on all the other answers, they would have put the game up here. if his team said they worked lots of overtime, it always moved down. So based on all the other cultural questions, they would have predicted a good game, but then they also worked lots of overtime, so the game turned out worse. So based on that, they concluded that the crunch causes bad games. It's not that bad games cause crunch. I thought that was interesting, but otherwise that's all I would say about crunch. And also it doesn't mean that like, so to fall into this trap, you kind of have to be in this like never-ending crunch world. If you just work like a little bit of overtime, like if you're over here, and just say like, I disagree, I agree maybe somewhat, or I disagree somewhat, you're probably still fine. Like if you're just staying late one night to like finish the thing up, that's fine, that's good. But if the more this gets, the worse it will be for your game. Good. So what are the main points from this last section? The things that really help. You want to encourage individuals to take creative risks. You want to give frequent direct feedback. You don't want to surprise people with things like that they needed to know 2 weeks ago. You want to have a realistic schedule and an engaged team with high standards and a company with values or mission. And that brings us to the main part, not the main part, this brings us to the final part, the really important part, which is the top 10 things that really make a difference. I think I'll quickly take a break before this because it was quite a lot of things. Alright, all relaxed, because this is gonna get intense. Let's get to it. Number 10. Most team members bought into the decisions that were made. I call this a committed and cohesive team, meaning not only do they believe in the decision, and they also they're all agreed, like everyone's on board. Number 9. Core elements of the game design frequently change during the development process. Very strong downward trend here. People who agree completely, they're all in trouble. So you don't want to change. You don't want to do big changes to the core of the game. I think the word core is important here, right? Other changes are fine, but don't change the core of the game. That really hurts you. Number 8. When we disagreed about game design, we resolved the disagreement instead of ignoring it. So I think this is related to the previous questions about like where team A goes off to do X and team B goes off to do Y. You want to get them back on board. You want to resolve those disagreements and make sure that like they work on a shared thing. People don't disagree and like everyone tries to get their own little pet thing into the game, even if those are competing. Number 7. If core design elements changed, studio leaders were able to clearly communicate and justify why they changed. So you want to avoid changing core design elements, but if you have to change them, you want to clearly communicate and you want to be able to justify. You want to have good reasons for why you changed them. And communicate. This comes up over and over again. It seems to be really important. Number 6. I was confused by the differing visions of what the major goals of the game were among our team leads, designers, producers, product managers, etc. Right? You don't want completely confusing goals. You want to resolve those disagreements. Number 5. The development plan for the game was clear and well communicated to the team. Yes. So you want to have a plan, and you want to make sure that people know it. So tell your people like, okay, so our plan is this month we're working on this feature, and next month we're working on this feature, and that will lead to this other thing, and that's how we're going to make the game. Right? Make sure that your people roughly know like when things are going to come online. Make sure you have a plan and communicate it to people so that they know when to expect what and what they're working towards. Number 4. Most team members had a similar vision of what this game was throughout the process of making it. So you want to have a shared vision. Everyone should have the same idea. You can also have this up here with a cohesive team, like buying into the decisions. Number 3. The team believed enthusiastically in the vision for this game. Right? So we can start to see like this is all about like vision, questions about the vision for the game and team believing in it. Number 2. Our final game closely resembled the initial vision for the game. So we want to have a stable vision. So I said at the beginning of the talk how some questions, they seem to cluster. all together. Other questions are more spread out. It seems like this vision question, it doesn't matter how you ask about it, like vision is just really important. They all cluster here at the end. No matter which way you ask, it's always really important. Vision is a thing, like a clear vision for the game. And with that, the final question, number 1, is the vision for the final version of the game was clear and well communicated to the team. So we can have all the other things in one. It has to be clear, has to be shared, stable, and well communicated. People have to know about it. Okay, so I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about vision and what this and how we can achieve these things. But before I go off and do that, I kind of want to ensure that you also know that all the previous things, they're also important. So what I'll do is I actually take some time, I'll talk about this dot down here. The one that says they agree completely with this question, but they still messed up. Right? They ended up with like a slightly below average score. So I went through the data and I tried to find this dot, and they were a team of, they were a team of 50 people. They made a racing game for consoles, and their success score was they shipped on time, they lost money, they had a Metacritic in the 60s, between 60 and 69. But they internally, they say they were happy with the game that they made. They had achieved their own internal company goals. That's what they say. And so the average of those scores is like slightly below average. So it didn't turn out like too well for them. So I went through all the questions, and like lots of things they answered really well, but I picked out only the things that they answered badly to show that you also have to do it, that these also matter. So they said, for example, our team sometimes seem to be stuck in a cycle of never-ending crunch overtime work. They agree completely with this, right? So that already means they're in trouble. There was a lot of turnover on this project. They agree somewhat. They lost good people. You don't want that. Team members would often work for weeks at a time without receiving feedback from project leads or managers. They agree somewhat, right? We talked about how important feedback is. If you work overtime, I believe it was because studio leaders or producers failed to scope the project properly. They agree with this, right? So they worked a lot of overtime, and the reason was that their schedule made no sense. I'm going to clear out some space here because there's more questions. Internal politics played a big role in the dynamics of the team. They agree. Right? So you can kind of imagine what the team is like at this point. Members had easy access to communicate with senior leadership about the project, raise concerns, or discuss personal issues. They disagree. Right? So this is strange to me because there were only 50 people. With 50 people, you should still be able to talk to everyone, but there seems to be tension there in that team. Some team members put their own careers above the collective goals of the game project. They agree completely, right? So they probably had like one asshole who worked at the studio in mind and was like, man, that guy ruined the game. Maybe, my interpretation. The entire team met frequently to openly discuss topics of interest and ask questions. They disagree, there was no questions. Finally, what sort of technology solution did the team use to create the game? They used a new engine. Right, so kind of like from this you can kind of get a picture of like how they worked, or like what the team was like. But you can see like, even though I spent the rest of the talk talking about vision, it's still important that you also do all the previous things. Cool. So what were the main points from this last section, from the top 10? It's all about the vision for the game. You want to have a clear vision. You want to communicate that vision to the team. You want to make sure they believe in it. Resolve your disagreements. You want to get rid of the competing, confusing goals. Don't change the vision too often, and if you do change it, communicate it very clearly and make sure that you can justify it and everyone's on board. Which brings us to the final part of this talk, which is how the heck do we do that? Because, I mean, sometimes you make a game and like you sit down, you have like this beautiful idea in your head and you explain it to everyone gets it immediately. And so you all sit down for 2 years, you program this thing into the computer, it turns out great, you don't have to change anything, the vision is stable, and it's great, it's beautiful, and you save lots of money. But in the real world, there's more problems, right? Like some features don't work out, you have to change things, right? There's disagreements, you want to try X, you want to try Y. Like some people don't get a feature or they disagree with it. So how do you get like this stable vision and like this shared vision, and how do you get all these nice things? Before we do that, I'll do another camera cut. Sorry. Okay, so how the heck do we do this? For this, we actually, the study actually doesn't give us that much, because most of their questions actually came from these books, which are about how to build effective teams. And these are probably good books, but they're about building effective teams. They're like kind of about generic topics. So there isn't really much game industry specific things in there. And in the study, they also added some game industry specific questions, and we can learn some things from that. Right? I mean, there's some things we can learn directly. Like communication seems to be really important, and like feedback and those things. But like this vision thing seems to kind of be unanswered. Like how do we get to that? So I also tried to like find some game industry specific lessons, and one thing I looked at this paper which is called "What Went Right, What Went Wrong," an analysis of 155 postmortems from game development. So they looked at a lot of postmortems of game developers writing on Gamasutra. The paper's actually not that good, so I don't necessarily recommend reading it, but there's still some lessons that we can learn from them. So let me talk about those. The first thing that they talk about is that everyone has problems with scoping. And specifically like feature creep seems to be really hurt projects. And so, I mean, that makes sense, because what feature creep does to the project is, if you have too many features, that means at some point you have to cut the features, right? And if you have to like cut some of your main features, well, what does that do to the vision of the game, right? Now you've got a giant hole in your design, you have to patch it up, and it's just going to be a mess to like deal with feature creep, and then when you have to cut things, cleaning that up. Earlier in the talk, in the section of things that were really important, we had these 2 bullet points that said you want to allow allow individuals to take creative risks, but you also want to have a realistic schedule. And those two seem to kind of be in conflict with each other. I actually think that most people already know how to resolve this disagreement, because kind of you have to think, like, you already know which creative risks are more safe to take and which ones are less safe to take. So if your current task in game development is, let's say you're a designer and your task is to build like 3 towns in this world right now, that's your task for the next week. Let's say you're really creative by building one of those towns, that's probably a fine thing to do. Because you did your normal task that you were supposed to do, you were just really creative while doing it. Or if you have like this little thing that you came up with that you can get in half a day, that's a cool thing to do. But what you want to avoid is you want to avoid things where you say, hey, I have this really cool idea, I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks on it. That's not a good idea, because that's going to blow the schedule, right? Maybe during pre-production, that's fine, like when you're still experimenting, but not during main game development. The other way of looking at these points is, if you look at the other way around. If you have a realistic schedule, if your schedule makes sense, then you're more free to take creative risks, because you've got more like wiggle room in your schedule, right? So the way I've heard this, I've heard, well, the best way I've heard this articulated is to say, you want to under-promise and over-deliver. So if you can make, say, 4 features for the next milestone, you want to only promise 3 of those features, so that if like one of those doesn't work out, or you have to be like more quick, or you want to take a creative risk, you can, because you have to do 4, but you only promise 3, right? So if you have a realistic schedule, then creative risks are more allowed. The other lesson from the paper was that there's a repeated pattern where teams use prototyping and playtests to clarify and communicate the vision for the game. So playtests, I mean both external playtests, but also company internal playtests. It seems like having prototypes is a really good way of communicating within the company, so everyone understands, oh, this is the kind of game we're making. Yeah, also prototyping is just yes, it's a good way to clarify the idea, because like once you actually see it in person, all of a sudden you know what the idea really is, and like what really works and what doesn't work. And then from that standpoint, pre-production is actually not about generating as many ideas and prototypes as you can. Instead, you should think of pre-production as a part where you clarify your ideas, where you communicate them to the rest of the team, so everyone's on board and everyone has played your prototypes and understands, oh, this is the game we're making. Okay. So I was going to talk more about prototyping, but I asked some colleagues of mine who have more experience than I have, and they told me that there's actually a bunch of risks associated with prototyping. So I'll talk about that. Because prototyping, there's two ways it can go wrong. One is it's easy to fool yourself. You can easily say that your prototype actually nobody likes it, but you think it's great. That's an easy way to fool yourself. Or you can say, yeah, it doesn't work too well just now, but it'll be great if we just add a bunch of production values, like we just add particles and sounds and all that stuff. It'll be so much better. The other way that's easy to mess up is it's easy to test the wrong thing. So if you make a fun prototype, or if you make a fun prototype in a simple 2D prototype, but it doesn't actually translate to 3D. For whatever reason, there's so many translations that have to happen that it can easily go wrong somewhere. Or you make a prototype that's fun in isolation, but it doesn't work with the rest of the game, or some other feature ruins it, or it just never quite fits in. So then I asked some more people and asked what really works. And here's advice I got. The first thing is that you want to find your sound, and this is kind of like an analogy from music, where every really good band has a distinct sound. You can just hear this band from the first few notes of a song. And similarly, every good rock band has a good sound, you want to find the kind of the sound of your or the style of games that your studio makes. Because if you know your style, then that immediately clarifies a lot of things about the vision of the game. Because I said here, you want to find you want to know what this team and this techie is the kind of game that we can really make. You want to think what is this team good at? But yeah, so if you have a distinct style, a lot of these problems that we had earlier about clarity of vision, competing goals, they just disappear because you just you know the kind of game you're making, everyone's on board, and everyone's really good at making those games. A lot of uncertainties don't even come up. But the main thing that really works is you want to be incremental. And being incremental means things like making a sequel, or make something in an existing genre, or do a new take on an old game. I mean, maybe make a remake or something, or make a bigger version of a small game. This last one, what I mean with that is I mean things like Dota 2 or PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, which started off as mods and then they turn into standalone games. Or plenty of examples like Counter-Strike, lots of tower defense games, things like that. Okay, so let me talk about incrementalism. And so incremental doesn't mean you have to be boring. I think you can be incremental and still make very interesting games. And my example of this is Gone Home, where Gone Home is an indie game which is all about exploring this empty house and trying to find out what happened here, why is your family not home? And I say that Gone Home is actually a pretty incremental game, because Gone Home couldn't have happened without BioShock. Because the developers of Gone Home, while making BioShock, they got all this experience of this environmental storytelling and of audio logs and leaving hidden notes in the world and finding those and leaving clues and all that stuff. And then they decided, let's just make a game only about this part that we really like in BioShock and leave out all the shooting and violence and all that. And that's how they made Gone Home. And also Gone Home is a pretty small game, right? It's a 3-hour game. So that also really helped. If you are incremental, maybe start off, if you make a really new thing, maybe start off making a small game and then later make a bigger version of the small game. At the same time, BioShock is also an incremental game because it couldn't have happened without System Shock 2. So BioShock is essentially saying, let's take System Shock 2 and turn it into a modern shooter with nice graphics and good movement, good abilities, all those nice modern things or more high quality things. Of course, System Shock 2 is an incremental game over System Shock 1, and you can trace it back further and further until at some point there were small games at the beginning. The small games are less risky and but they're also incremental because they're smaller. So what if we actually have to make a new game or feature? It can't be an incremental thing, it has to be a new thing. Well, if you work on that, your number one thing is to clarify, your number one task is to clarify what that new thing that you're making is. So you want to reduce uncertainty in as many ways as you can, and this uncertainty may not be or maybe in your head, you may not be clear about how a certain feature it's going to interact with other things, but it may also be in other people's head. Maybe things are totally clear in your head, but others do not have that clarity. So you want to identify where is there some fog of uncertainty, people don't know how this is going to work with that, or they don't know what it's going to look like or what it's going to sound like, and you want to like put a prototype right in the middle of that uncertainty, and make people play the prototype to communicate using that. But actually, I talk about an example here, which did a different approach, and this is Braid. So Braid is again about controlling time, and if I tell you I'm going to make a game about controlling time, that's a very vague thing. It's not like there's a lot of games I could do if I make a game about controlling time. So it doesn't like that. That's a lot of uncertainty that's right there. And so what they did, which is really smart, is what Jonathan Blow did is he used the game mechanics of classic platformers, and that immediately takes out a huge amount of uncertainty from your game, because everyone knows how classic platformers work. Like you go from left to right, you jump on enemies, you go through doors to different worlds, like there's going to be some puzzles along the way, all those things. And so as soon as you make a classic platformer, like everyone understands how it works, and a lot of like questions don't even come up. Like you know how to get from A to B, and you know how to put obstacles in the way, and you have like lots of like variables to play with. There's lots of verbs all of a sudden that are available. You can go back to previous games to find solutions that they used for certain problems, how they got variety, how they got like increments of difficulty. You have got so much available that you can go back to. The other thing that Jonathan Blow did is he had a prototype for the time control mechanics. And the prototype was a game where you play pool or snooker or one of those games, billiards, and but you could control time. So if you made a bad shot in billiards, you could rewind time and like try a new shot. And that prototype actually didn't work, but he was smart enough to realize that it didn't work, so he didn't fool himself with the prototype. And but he kept the idea in the back of his head, and then eventually he made Braid, which is a different game with the time control mechanic. So I want to talk about this idea of reusing existing ideas, and my main statement here is if your team can play an existing game where an idea already works, that's much better than any prototype you could make, because in an existing game you can see not only that the idea works and you can play it and you can hand it to people and see here's how it is, which you could also do with a prototype. But in an existing game, you can already see how it works with like graphics, how it works with UI, how the particles work, how it's communicated, how the player feedbacks works, how the various other systems around it work, how it evolves. You can also see where it doesn't work, like it doesn't work too well with this other feature. You can see problems. You can learn a lot about a feature if you can play it in an existing game. And it's a really good way of communicating about a feature. You just sit someone down and see here, play this, see how they did the graphics, right? Or see how they did the sound, or see how they did whatever, the AI around it. And so one thing that I want to point out specifically is one thing you can do is you can take something that's a small idea in an existing game and make it a bigger idea in your game. So and this actually, like this one is when I brought this up in the talk, like lots of people came out to me afterwards and they gave me so many examples where they said, yeah, we did this and we took like a small idea in some other game, we made a big idea in our game. It's like, I don't know, things like, they had like the crash mode in Burnout. This was one example that another guy gave me. Saying, yeah, this was like, we took this from this other game and we made it a big thing in Burnout, and it was made for a great game. And the other thing that's to say about this is, if you follow the previous point about making sure that you find the style of your, like if you find the sound or the style of your studio, then if your studio has a certain style, that kind of ensures that you're going to make something original here, because you're going to take somebody else's idea, but you're going to do it in your style, which immediately makes it which immediately makes it more original looking to other people, because it's done in a different style. The final thing I want to mention here in this context is, this is kind of my own pet theory, that there's certain gameplay that has rich vocabularies is best for reuse. And so rich vocabularies, I'm thinking of things like shooters, platformers, third person fighting, like things that come up over and over again, that as soon as you make a game in those genres, you just have a huge amount of solutions available to you. you basically get variety for free, you get progression for free, you get all these things that other people have already solved for you, that you didn't, like, there's problems solved for you that you didn't even know that you had to solve. If you try to do things from scratch, and sometimes you see indie teams doing that, where they try to do everything from scratch, and they have to resolve all these problems that other people had already solved, and those problems would have never come up if they had only used like one of those genres with a rich vocabulary. RPG mechanics in particular, like you can layer them on almost everything and they just solve problems for you. It's kind of magical. Okay. So the summary for this part about vision. So here's how to achieve a clear, well-communicated vision that everybody believes in, that doesn't have to change too often. I can't quite promise this, but here's how you get in that direction. So you want to find your sound, you want to be incremental. If you have to make a new game, you want to still find ways to be incremental. That's kind of what my point here was, of reusing existing ideas to communicate. You want to avoid feature creep, because feature creep means that you have to cut features and then that really hurts your vision. You want to prototype new ideas, and you want to playtest those prototypes to communicate. Like make your entire team play everything like in the game so they know the kind of game that they're making. Good. And that brings me to the summary for the whole talk, which is here's kind of the main points from this whole talk. So you want to build a team where people feel safe to take creative risk and safe to speak up. You want to give frequent direct feedback, and you want to listen to feedback. If people give you feedback, you want to be able to listen to that and change your mind if you have to. If people have good reasons. You want to have a realistic schedule. You want to have an engaged team with high standards. This point is basically all about hiring, like you want to hire good people. You want to have collective goals, avoid competing goals, and resolve disagreements. And most of all, you want to work really hard to clarify and communicate your vision, to make sure everyone's on board. And that's my talk, that's evidence for how to make great games. Thanks.